People in INS are working with people that are victims and witnesses of crime all the time.
We deal with people as our evidence. At the same time, we have to show humanity and be able to respond to their needs.
They have certain rights, and if those rights have been violated, it is our legal duty to go ahead and investigate these cases.
They have been completely traumatized by the horror that they've undergone.
Dealt with an agent that was very abrupt, very intimidating, and it's hurtful.
Part of the work isn't just enforcing laws, it's working with people so that they feel they can defend their own rights.
The immigration service of today is not what it was 5 years ago or 15 years ago, and even last year. We wear two hats, where we have to deport illegal aliens and where we have to prosecute people for criminal crimes.
If we want to put those criminals out of business, to keep them from continuing to exploit or abuse other individuals, we need to prosecute them to the fullest extent of the law.
And the same people that we might have to deport in the administrative side may be our victim witnesses on the criminal side. So we have a balance that we have to maintain because of the economic disparity between Mexico and the United States. The border area for a pedophile, it's like a baited hunting ground because he can just provide food, shelter, and little things and be done with his seduction. And so you have kids that were victims, Mexican children, undocumented children.
These are all things the boys were carrying.
Carrying or had, and it was able, he could look at these mementos and be able to relive in his fantasy life the sexual experience with the people related to these different items.
There must have been hundreds of victims then.
Easily. He was very prolific.
When the criminal case first broke and there was an arrest made, my client was detained as a material witness. He didn't have a mom, he didn't have a dad, he'd been on the streets for years and had somehow managed to survive.
It's very important that everyone work together for the benefit of the child who's a vulnerable person here in the United States, whether they're here illegally or not.
Brian helped get us an I-94, which is a document that allowed our client to stay in the United States legally, to be here. He was paroled in. And then we filed an application under, it's called a special immigrant application, that applies to juveniles who are wards of the court.
The child has very mixed emotions and needs to understand that he was the victim of a crime. And so they need counseling to be able to deal with that and to come to terms with it.
Good afternoon, Family Service. This is Christy. How may I help you?
One day, Brian Joyce showed up. And he was an INS agent, but he was very different in the sense that he had a very, very good knowledge of children and of sexual abuse. And he was looking for resources within the community to address the need of children who were Mexican citizens.
An agent needs to make it a point to sort of learn about the people or the victims and really make the effort to do something to help them. The courts can appoint an advocate for the child, and that sort of gets the ball rolling. And then if that advocate can get the cooperation of the INS agent, well, then you can do something.
Charlie, how have you used kind of a task force? I mean, you guys were really involved in helping to develop the brochures. In getting this underway, I soon realized that the only way that we really could have a comprehensive treatment of crime victims in our district was to do, that I couldn't do it alone, that I needed to have the help of people in other agencies and to work together in doing that. And it just made sense. It seemed very logical that having a victim witness task force was the best way to achieve this.
And a lot of people don't realize that it is California law that we have to report these abusive actions.
Traditionally, the Immigration Service has been in the business, so to speak, of deporting people from the United States.
Cindy Schultz, who has always been the representative on the task force, came to the task force saying, you know, we don't really have victims and witnesses, and I don't really know why I'm here, but, you know, I got to be here, and so, you know, I'll see kind of what it's all about. And before you knew it, she started assessing, finding out situations in her agency where people in INS are working with people that are victims and witnesses of crime all the time.
It's a whole different mind concept to realize that that victimization doesn't pay attention to whether somebody's here legally in the United States or here illegally in the United States. A victim is still a victim. Two of the agents encountered a hearing impaired Mexican in one of the shopping malls here locally. Well, the big problem is that he was also a victim. And what we were really interested in is the perpetrators and the people that had brought him into the United States and were holding him captive.
And then she was able to bring those experiences as people found out who she was and what her duties were to our task force and educate us on the different ways that immigration was involved in dealing with victims and witnesses.
Debbie gave me names of some of the community agencies in the deaf community, and we did find him housing in a place called, you know, appropriately enough, a deaf house. As a result of the task force, I have access to state and local resources so that if somebody does need rape counseling or they need a women's shelter, but they need something that's specific to their nationality, I have a list of agencies that I can go to.
I can't begin to tell you how many victims have been willing to go through some really, really tough times, trial continuances, being intimidated, having to be relocated, disruptions in their lives, and a lot of them are willing to do it just because of the great response that they got from working with an immigration officer who has been there for them in every way.
People in exploited situations, and particularly in trafficked situations, are told that you're the one who will be punished if you report what's going on. And you're the one who's in this country illegally, so in particular the punishment comes from at the hands of the INS.
People in these communities, in refugee or immigrant communities, are afraid of the INS. They're afraid of the authorities, the police. And one reason is because of their legal status. But another reason is that they come from countries often where the police are genuinely very scary.
Trafficking is one way in which people bring in laborers in order to get the cheapest labor and the most exploitable labor possible. Individuals, and usually groups of individuals, become easy targets for forced servitude, and they end up in situations where they are making garments or cleaning homes or forced to engage in prostitution in order to help pay off a debt that they incurred in getting here.
The Almani case involved an investigation and subsequent prosecution of 10 individuals who, during at least 4-year period of time, held mostly women, garment workers against their will in conditions of slavery in a suburb called El Monte. We charged and successfully prosecuted 8 of the 10 individuals for their role in this enslavement of the workers.
There was many signs of physical confinement. There was a barbed wire along the walls. The windows were boarded up. But I think in other situations it's very hard to detect because the confinement is mainly a psychological coercion.
And that is threats against their family members, their children, their parents, their siblings. In other words, you behave and do what you're told or your sister's going to die.
There's many, many Asian factories, Asian employees in the United States that are in a state of bondage that the only way to really detect it is to interview them, is to ask them, where's your passport, for example. If the passport is being held by the employer, that's the biggest sign that, yeah, they're depriving this person of freedom of movement in the United States or freedom to return to their home country.
I think the Almani case was a model of how similar cases ought to be dealt with. One of the lead case agents spoke Thai, wrote Thai, and read Thai, and that was very helpful with regard to overcoming cultural and language obstacles.
One of the things we have done is provide services. They need to be in a place that's safe and secure, where they won't be harassed by their traffickers. Independence is very important for their sense of their own value and their sense of esteem, self-esteem, and their sense of empowerment.
One of the greatest lessons that I learned from Almani was the great importance of these community service providers. Had it not been for the care they provided and the support they provided to our victims, we could not have conceived of prosecuting the case.
A very positive event in the Almonte case was that the witnesses are given work authorization, which allows them to essentially start rebuilding their lives.
I think there was empathy. I think there was an understanding of the plight of the workers in this case. And I think that the INS went to extraordinary measures to make the process as effective, efficient, and tried to put the victims as much at ease during the length of the investigation and prosecution as they could.
There is no set background for where domestic violence is going to occur. We see it with laborers, we see it with the unemployed, we see it with professionals, white collar, blue collar. I don't care what walk of life, I don't care what economic level, we see it.
In this case, the defendant was abusive physically, was also what I'm told is a compulsive gambler. The family rarely had any money and would take his wife and his son from state to state.
We were in a shelter to help families who are on welfare to get themselves a job and get them established. And so he would really take the welfare check and he would go off. I knew he was gambling. And this is when things would get tough, a lot of pressure, then the abuse would start on.
It's not necessarily the initial charge that we're dealing with, but the domestic violence is what has brought the individual to the court. Usually if there's domestic violence, there's other crimes in the history also.
For an abused woman, a lot of things could happen. And my son was taken away from me.
What's becoming a common event is the child abduction.
Ultimately, he stole his son from a daycare center, falsified his paperwork, and took him out of the country to Lebanon, to a refugee camp where he himself had grown up.
I've dealt with an agent that was very, very abrupt, very intimidating, and it's hurtful and it's frustrating, especially when you're fighting for your son's return home. The third time I was in court, a INS agent was there watching the case closely. He gave me his card, told me if I had any questions that I could call on him, and that's how I got involved with Mr. Fennell.
The main point was getting the son returned to his mother. The next was the defendant making sure that he would be arrested and incarcerated and set up for deportation.
And I wanted to know which kinds of crimes would suffice to form the basis for a deportation proceeding against the defendant. When I talked to Agent Fennell, he was certainly very cooperative and very helpful, and had a genuine interest in this case in helping this woman get her child back.
Well, I was dealing with an agent who I saw him face to face. I think it was easier for him to understand because he went to court there. He saw what I was dealing with.
I had been with the mother and seen her break down quite a few times, so it was very rewarding to me that once I learned that the mother had custody of her son, there was a clear-cut result, satisfaction from, I think, everyone except for the defendant.
I think the agent's treatment of any individual is crucial. But your bottom line is that if you've given them the cold shoulder and as they've tried to talk to you, then when you need something back from them, you may wind up with a cold shoulder and they may want to wash their hands of it completely and walk away, and you don't have a completed case.
For years, it's been a hugely wasted opportunity that the state and federal agencies don't work more closely together. This was an excellent example to me of what could be accomplished when they do work together, and combined, the degree of power and the amount of resources is staggering.
I was ecstatic, very ecstatic. My reaction was very rewarding, very fulfilling.
¡Abre la puerta! Go out the back over there.
The way that aliens look at INS and the Border Patrol is, we're only here to go ahead and apprehend them and kick them back out of the country, which was the norm at one time. There's a lot of stories within the Border Patrol and INS that people never see, actually, where there's a lot of compassion. And a lot of people go to extremes to actually try to help these people.
The immigrant workers are really kind of the embodiment of the American dream, because what they want is just to work really hard and maintain their families. The farmers want them here because they're working for these very low wages and enduring sacrifices.
They are taken advantage of by the transporters, the smugglers, the crew leaders.
Okay, boys, we got entry into 710.
The Miguel Flores case was a very complex slavery case. Miguel Flores was bringing people from Guatemala, Mexico, and forcing them to work for free.
They would pack them in at the border, 30 of them, in a van, and drive them for 3 days. They let you out of the van, and the first thing you hear is, if you try to escape, I'll cut your tongues out. And from then, the atmosphere of intimidation begins.
They kept saying that if we were lucky, we would leave alive, but otherwise we would leave dead.
They were placed into the fields, still and dark, forced to work 14 to 16-hour days.
At the end of the week, they'd say, well, we're going to deduct for the transportation debt you owe, for rent, for food, for drink. And this way, they had a virtually free labor force all summer long.
That would net Miguel Flores and his organization in excess of anywhere from $15,000 to $35,000 weekly.
And these were all just people who really had no idea that this is what was in store for them.
If you're going to do any of these cases, somebody in your agency will have to break the ice with one of these action groups. For example, like Florida Rural Legal Services, they're probably going to be the first that's actually going to field a complaint. And without that, you're going to be hard-pressed in actually getting some of the victims to actually come forward.
Mike Brown did a real good job investigating.
Básicamente trataba a las víctimas como lo que eran, o como lo que fueron, ¿va?
He treated the people as they really were, as victims, and not as if they were people coming from some other country to disrupt the tranquility of this country.
We came eye to eye with these people. We sat down, got a rapport working with them. Once we explained to them that they had a right, they fully understood that, well, the Border Patrol and INS aren't going to be the bad guys anymore. They're actually out here to help us.
It is also important for the investigator to be able to understand the language of the victims and to be able to understand their customs, values, norms, and belief. If you fail to understand how they feel, what they think, then you will not be able to complete a successful investigation.
You can't promise them the moon and say, look, I'm going to make you a permanent resident alien if you help me with this thing. You got to be upfront and say, there's a chance that you're going to have to go home. There may be a chance that, depending on what happens with the outcome, the government itself might be able to help you as a cooperating material witness.
The main thing was to emphasize that through their testimony and cooperation, what they went through will not happen to anybody else.
Once they escaped and got off the camp and decided to participate in pursuing this investigation, they also took the initiative of pushing it along, of wanting to see justice done. And that's where you have victims, but who are at the same time taking charge of the situation once they're given that option.
We're coming to the forefront of national attention. Immigration is a big thing now. We're doing more cases, we're doing higher profile cases.
We can have a victim on every immigration case we come across.
Any steps the INS takes in order to create a climate in which it is safer for victims of crime to come forward is a positive step in the right direction.
You have to recognize that they're a victim. You have to tell them what their rights are as a victim, and then refer them for services.
The agent does not have to work alone. There's resources out there to help them. Groups like our task force, victim witness coordinators, domestic violence shelters, child abuse hotlines.
We need to try to get out from that black shroud that we used to be categorized under, that we're always the bad guys.
And we just have to move forward, and this is part of that progress.